Like just absolutely bursting at the seams with love. Oh, did I sound dumb saying that? Well, hello, my beautiful bookish friends, and welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you are new here. My name is Lori Beth, and welcome to my little corner of the internet, aka my booktube channel, where I like to talk about all things bookish. And specifically, in today's video, we're gonna talk about books that you can read over a weekend. Now, I accidentally inspired myself to do this video from the last video that I did, which was my winter book recommendations. I will link that down below if you have not watched that video. But I did have a few books in there that I realized were a little bit on the smaller side and that you could really just cozy up with and read them in a few days' time. That made me think, what could I really read in one weekend if I had the opportunity to? And that led me to create a list of books that I think you could sit down and read from cover to cover in one weekend. Now, I know that we are all a little bit different when it comes to the rate in which we can read books, meaning the speed at which you read them. And I have actually always considered myself not really a very fast reader. I think I'm kind of a slow reader if I'm being honest. So I decided that I am going to break this video into two different categories. So category 1 is going to be books that are under 200 pages, and category 2 are going to be books that are between 201 and 300 pages. So I am personally considering a weekend, Friday afternoon through Sunday night. That to me is what makes up a weekend. So that is what I had in my head when I put this list of books together and broke it into two different categories because, again, we all read differently. Some of us are like, a 200-page book I could maybe squeeze out in a weekend, and others are like, hey, I could probably read about 300 pages in 3 days. So hopefully, no matter which category you fall into, you will find a book in this video that you could cozy up and read over a few days' time. And speaking of cozying up, I would like to take a minute to thank the partner of today's video, which is Novelwicks Candles. Novelwicks is an amazing small business run by a woman named Murphy who is out there making all of your bookish dreams come to fruition with the most delicious candle scents you have ever experienced. Murphy herself hand pours every candle that comes out of her shop, and every candle in her shop represents some form of media that you or someone in your life is guaranteed to have a passion for. So I just recently received my new Christmas candles from Novelwicks. They are both Elf and the Grinch themed. They are absolutely yummy as far as the scents go, and they are so stunning, and I can't wait to display them this holiday season in my home. Novelwicks always releases new candles every Thursday, which you can find in her shop, linked down below, or you can check out her Instagram or my Instagram for whichever candles are coming out that week. I am so excited to announce that I am going to be a rep for the winter season for this amazing company, and that you can use my code LORI10 to get a discount on your order. And after you go pick out a candle for yourself, or maybe even as a gift for someone else this holiday season, come back to this video and drop in a comment down below which one you chose. So per usual, we do have quite a few books to go over in the video today, so we are going to go ahead and jump right into our very first category. All right, first up on our list is This Is Amiko, Do You Copy by Natsuko Imamura, and this is the smallest book on our list today, coming in at a whopping 122 pages. So this book itself is just a teeny tiny translated novel, but it packed a big punch. And the synopsis on the back states, meet young Amiko. She's one of a kind, full of life and good intentions, but with no filter or boundaries. She happily inhabits a world of her own, making oblivious to offenses given or taken. But when it comes to expressions of love, where conflicting signals are hard to grasp and a heart is easily broken, there can be unintended consequences. An aching, tender description of belonging and loss, This Is Amiko, Do You Copy, is a portrait of childhood through the eyes of an irrepressible young girl. So again, this book is the smallest on our list, but packed one of the biggest punches that I read in this past year. And I absolutely devoured this, like sat down and read this in one day because I was so enamored by Amiko and following her story from childhood into like young adult life. It was very gripping in the sense of Amiko kind of seems to struggle with social interactions and recognizing emotional and social behavior, at least in the quote-unquote normal sense. So she seems to never really take offense to too much or doesn't notice when she causes offense to others. But she also lives in this world where she's kind of shut out and not really understood or cared for by her own family. And again, as small as this book is, she kind of goes through this journey through just 100 pages or so. That really just makes you feel connected to her and so much sympathy for this character. So if you are not sure if you like something like a translated novel, this is a really good book to start with because it's not overly long, not something you have to invest a lot of time in to kind of get a gauge for whether or not you would like something like translated fiction. And also if you just like maybe like very genuine characters. This was kind of a little bit of a heartbreaking story, but also heartwarming at the same time. You really just can't help but love Amiko and what she's going through. But you kind of just want to see if she's going to be happy at the end of this book. And it was just very impactful for being so short. All right. And next up on our list is It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Anne DeMarkin. And this comes in at 128 pages. This was another book that was teeny tiny, but packed such a punch that I thought about it long after I put it down. And I think this was another one that I actually read in about a day because I just couldn't stop reading it. So this is another fiction novel, but kind of touches on a little bit of fantasy because we follow a main character in this book who is a zombie. And she's a zombie that kind of just like wakes up in this afterlife and is trying to put together pieces of her former alive human life. She knows that she was super in love, but she doesn't know with what or with who. And she is just kind of lost in a drift through this entire story, trying to finally peg down exactly what she left behind in her old life. Along the way, she's kind of just going through this journey of discovering what it's like being in this zombie form. And she lives in this world where zombies are just prevalent and they're kind of coexisting along with humans now. But the zombies in the story are very cognizant. Like she can think, she can talk, she can move around. But all these like really weird things happen to her, like because she is dead, like her arm falls off at the very beginning of the book and she just doesn't want to lose something else from her past. So she's trying to hang on to it, like literally hang on to it for as long as she can. It was just a really beautifully written story about like life and death, the space in between, like what happens, like what would happen to us if we ever ended up there, and what is it that we would seek out, and how do we like find happiness in life or the afterlife. It was just such an original story and very gripping, and I loved the entire book being narrated by someone that we never even truly meet. Like we never learn her name. She can't remember her name and we don't even know exactly what it is she wants, but she's out there trying to find it. It was very moving. And if you're not super into fantasy, you prefer more fiction, this has like a touch of that kind of sci-fi post-apocalyptic vibe to it, on top of it just being a fantasy novel, but it never feels like too much like that's the whole point of the book. It's kind of more about this main character and what she is looking for in this new life of hers. Is just absolutely beautiful. Highly recommend. All right, and next up on our list is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, and this book comes in at a whopping 151 pages. This is a fantasy sci-fi novel, but very much like a cozy fantasy sci-fi. So you're kind of like blending a few different things into one little cozy novel. So just a quick synopsis of this story. Centuries before robots of Panga gained self-awareness, laid down their tools, wandered en masse into the wilderness, never to be seen again. They faded into myth and urban legend. Now the life of the tea monk who tells the story upended by the arrival of a robot, there to honor the old promise of checking in. The robot cannot go back until the question of what do people need is answered. But the answer to that question depends on who you ask, and how. They will need to ask it a lot. Chambers' series asks, in a world where people have what they want, does having more matter? So you can already tell from the synopsis of the story, there's a much deeper message behind the narrative besides just like robots communicating with people. And it's done so in a very comforting way. Becky Chambers has this way of making her writing feel like a little hug, like a comforting hug, while still asking you some of the most important questions of life. Like, can you just exist? Do we need more? Why do we always want more? It is a very charming story, a little whimsical because of that sci-fi fantasy narrative, but it also is bringing a message to the forefront of the book, and it is also a series, so if you pick this one up and like it, there are more to be read. But Becky Chambers herself is just a very beautiful author, and her writing really comes through in this story, even though it is only 151 pages long. And next up is an author that you have heard me talk about quite a few times on this channel now, but I just can't get enough of them. And this story in particular, which was What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, and this book itself is 165 pages. So this story itself is a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher from Edgar Allan Poe, but it is done in a very unique way. So in this story, we follow a main character who has gotten word from their friends that they are unwell. They live in this big, decrepit manor, and they are going to visit them because it sounds like they are so unwell that they might actually be
kicking the bucket anytime soon.
When they get there, they start to discover all of these very weird goings-on that happen in the house, like seeing ghostly figures in the middle of the night. There's a really weird pond close to the house where all of the fish are not acting normal or right. And there's just a lot of odd things surrounding this manor in general, like a lot of fungi, a lot of really weird things growing, and animals acting unwell. Things are just off. The really cool thing about T. Kingfisher's writing, especially in this book, was the ability to take such a classic story and put these like earthy gothic vibes on top of it and like make it feel like a totally different story, but also a story you recognize at the same time. So the writing is just a little grotesque, but also cozy, and the characters have this witty banter that somehow makes you giggle in the middle of like these really dark things happening. So it ends up being this really unique blend of like funny one-liners that make you laugh, but also like this dark gothic vibe. And I just really love the atmosphere that comes forward in all of T. Kingfisher's books, but this one specifically, I really, really loved, and I sped through this story. I also believe that this one is a series. I think the second one is already out to this, but I will correct myself if I'm wrong. If you're looking to get into this author's works, highly recommend this one. All right, next up is probably one of the most unique books that I have read this year, and that is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman, and this one comes in at 175 pages. This is another fiction novel with that post-apocalyptic feel to it as well, without it feeling like you are just reading an end-of-the-world story. There's so much life in this story that it doesn't feel like things are completely ending, at least at the beginning of the book. But let me read the synopsis for you so you can get a better understanding of this novel. Deep underground, 39 women live imprisoned in a cage. Watched over by guards, the women have no memory of how they got there, no notion of time, and only a vague recollection of their lives before. As the burn of electric light merges day into night and numberless years pass, a young girl, the 40th prisoner, sits alone and outcast in the corner. Soon she will show herself to be the key to the others' escape and survival in the strange world that awaits them above ground. So without giving too many spoilers for the entire book, it does start with the story of this young woman, again, nameless, who is the youngest prisoner in this cage full of women. She does not remember how she got there, and neither do any of the other women around her. They just know that they had a life before, and they don't know why they're here now. They are literally trapped in a cage where they are surrounded by guards, and they are just fed at certain times of the day or night. They don't even really know if it's night or day anymore because they are somewhere underground in a bunker. And they don't even know if they are technically living on like a 24-hour clock anymore. So the book was a very beautiful look into the human behavior when you are kind of trying to just recreate from nothing, like keeping something like a schedule and making relationships with people that you are just stuck with and you didn't get to pick, living a life in a very certain set of circumstances and how to find peace and happiness within it. It was a very, very deep story, and I also didn't know where the story was going to go. I was so hooked into this and trying to figure out what was going to happen that I could not wait to get home and finish reading this book. When I was out during the day, I was like, all I could think about was this story and what was going to happen to not just our main character, but all the characters as time went on. Again, it has that post-apocalyptic feel because they are somehow living in this bunker and they don't know why or how they got there. And they don't know like what the reason is that they are being held here and also watched by these guards. It's very, very deep, a very kind of like haunting and heartbreaking story. So again, bringing a lot of emotion and feeling into a book under 200 pages is something that I have very much discovered that I love. I kind of like just being so fully hooked into something and so fully gripped and not being able to stop until I figure out what happens, and having it kind of in a shorter format really gives you the opportunity to do that. So I really, really recommend this, especially if you love kind of books about not just human nature, but women in general. It's very moving. Okay, so we have made it to the last book in our under 200 page category, and it is honestly, still to this day, one of my favorite books of all time. The very first time I read it was in my advanced composition class in high school, and it was one that I had to kind of analyze and break down. And it was the first time I remember being so enamored with the messages that an author was trying to bring through in a story. And that is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And this comes in at 180 pages. So I think most of us know the synopsis of The Great Gatsby and that it is a fiction novel and kind of like a classic fiction novel. This is my most reread book. I don't even know how many times I have actually read this book, and it is because it is both so short, but also a very poignant story for being so short. So this is like a 1920s jazz age era story where we follow our main character, Nick, who rents a cottage for the summer, and next to his cute little cottage is this enormous mansion by his neighbor who he eventually meets, named Jay Gatsby. Nick spends the summer kind of gallivanting around New York and outside of New York in East and West Egg with his cousin Daisy, and discovers that Daisy and Gatsby have a history together, and they kind of start to come back together through time over the summer. It's a very whimsical story. It feels very fast paced. Like there's just so much going on. There's parties and drinking and all of these people just like acting like there's no care in the world. Money is no object. It just gives off this like glamorous, romanticized feeling of life at the time, but there are just such deep issues happening within each character that kind of start to come through over time. Again, I just love this story so, so much. I love that it is, at the end of the day, a romance novel, but again, the drama surrounding it just makes the story feel like so intense. And I remember the first time reading it, I was just like flipping through the pages because I couldn't get enough of these people and their lifestyle. It is truly one of my favorite books of all time, and I've talked about reading classics recently, but if you are looking for a classic novel to read, this is a great one to start with if you aren't sure you really want to dabble into the classics, because it's not so old where it feels like you can't really connect with what these people are doing. Again, they're just kind of living like a wild ride of a summer, partying until the sun comes up, and I also think that it has like a little bit of something for everyone in a book that is still under 200 pages long. Hang in there, friends, because we are moving on to our next category, and the first book in this category, which is Sweet Bean Paste by Durian Sakagawa. And what a heartwarming, beautiful little book this was at only 218 pages. So let's read the synopsis of this one together. Sentaro has failed. He has a criminal record, drinks too much, and his dream of becoming a writer is just a distant memory. With only the blossoming of his cherry trees to mark the passing of time, he spends his days in a tiny confectionery shop selling dorayaki, a type of pancake filled with sweet bean paste. Until, that is, Toku comes into his life. An elderly woman with disfigured hands and a troubled past, she makes the best sweet bean paste Sentaro has ever tasted. The unlikeliest of friendships blossoms, but it will take all of the resolve and plenty of pancakes to protect themselves when Toku's dark secret comes to light. I mean, does that not just sound like a heartwarming story? Right from the synopsis to you? And it really, truly is. And again, another translated novel that packs a punch and a message behind the story itself. So the main character is this troubled guy who finds himself in debt to this woman's late husband, and the only way to pay off this debt is to continue to run this pancake shop for her where he makes this sweet bean paste. But he notices that the sales are kind of down and he's not doing as well as he used to. Along comes this older woman who has asked him on more than one occasion if she can work in this shop, but he quickly notices that she has these disfigured hands, and he thinks that it's not going to be a good look for this shop, and people aren't going to want to buy pancakes from this woman that has this disfigurement. So as time goes on, he finally folds and lets her work there, and he discovers that she makes the best sweet bean paste he has ever tasted, and suddenly sales are through the roof. Then the tables turn, and he is fighting for her to keep her job there because the woman who owns the shop doesn't want her working there either because of these disfigured hands. You start to learn more about this woman and where she came from and why she looks the way she does and her backstory. And you start to really change the way that you feel about Sentaro as the story goes on, because honestly, when it starts, you're like, this guy is kind of a jerk and really kind of mean to this old woman, and all she wants to do is work here. But they start to build this relationship over time that ends up being very heartwarming and very sweet. And it was just a very charming story of watching two people find happiness, and someone like Sentaro himself really finding his place in the world and kind of finally standing on his own 2 feet. It was really, really sweet. And again, if you're not sure if translated novels are necessarily for you, it's a shorter book. It does not take much time to read through. And because it is such a moving story, you really do feel like you are just sucked in fully and you want to see how things end up for both of these characters in the book. And next up, we have a book that I surprisingly don't hear more about, and I think that we should be talking about. And that is Catalina by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry if I butchered that name. Again, pronouncing beautifully written names has never been and probably will never be my forte, so please forgive me. But this was just a very unforgettable story, in my opinion, because I'm honestly still thinking about it. I think about it quite often. So we follow our main character, Catalina, and she is an immigrant in the United States, but not just an immigrant, she is undocumented. Her parents were killed in an accident when she was quite young, and she was sent to live with her grandparents in the United States, and they were also undocumented. So she has been raised by her grandparents since she's a child, and none of them have ever gained citizenship. So as Catalina grows up, graduates high school, she ends up getting into Harvard, where they have some sort of program that actually allows undocumented students to come and study there, and she finds herself in another whole new world that she wasn't fully prepared for. Catalina is actually wickedly smart. Like, not just book smart, she's smart. Does that make sense? Did I sound dumb saying that? As she's spending time in college and really just kind of struggling to fit in there and live this new life of like all these other responsibilities, like being a full-time student, she starts to kind of fall into this relationship with another student who has a very prominent family. And then other things start to happen in her family as well that kind of put her grandfather at risk. So now this young woman is out there just trying to live life. She feels the responsibility of trying to take care of her grandparents as the adult now and also make a life for herself, all while being an undocumented person in this country and worrying about what is going to happen once she leaves college and this program that allows her to stay there and study. It was a very intense story, and Catalina herself was just almost unlikable, but you couldn't help but like her. You know what I mean? Like, she was one of those characters that kind of drove you a little bit crazy. She kind of seemed like an asshole a lot of the times during the story, but she was also very conscious of the other people in her life. Like, she was an asshole, but she wanted to take care of her family and she wanted to just live her life finally and feel like she could breathe. The author's writing style was a little hard to comprehend at first, I will admit. There was kind of like some jumping around in the book. It felt kind of stream of consciousness. But once I got hooked, I was in. And it did not take me long to get through this book. Again, it was 224 pages. So something you could definitely sit down and read over a couple of days. All right, so then we have Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion, which is the only nonfiction novel on this list, and really one of the only nonfiction novels on my bookshelves, because I don't think I've read a nonfiction book since I've been in high school. But this one does come in at 238 pages. So I've talked about this briefly in another video about how I really wanted to read some Joan Didion, and I didn't really know where to start. So I was doing a bunch of research, and a lot of it pointed me towards her nonfiction works because that is what she is most known for. She does have a few fiction novels, but this was the one I decided to kind of dip my toe into the Joan Didion pool, and I was not disappointed, mostly because even though this was a nonfiction novel, it truly felt like just any other book I would pick up and read stories about people. So this book specifically is kind of a collection of her interviewing people in the 60s in California, and then also her own thoughts and feelings on life at this time, what it was like in California as a state in the 60s, and being a woman. It was just really kind of rich and deep with so many human interactions that I couldn't help but want to just keep going until I got to the next part of the book. Joan Didion herself was such a prominent author at the time, not just for being an author, but for being a woman and kind of changing the way that women were seen as journalists, authors, nonfiction and fiction. And she had this beautiful prose to her writing where she, even though she's like interviewing people, asking people questions, she's never judging. She's always just listening and simply retelling you someone's story. I was truly blown away by the way she was able to kind of put together this collection and make it feel like I was just reading a book. So I'm starting to repeat myself more and more, but if this is a genre you are not sure that you want to get into, or if you were specifically trying to get into Joan Didion as an author, I was very pleasantly surprised at how I was able to sink into and really feel connected to this nonfiction book. So I would highly recommend this one. And I am going to be reading more by her shortly because I just loved the way she came through on her pages so much. So moving on to another fiction novel on our list, and that is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. And this comes in at 240 pages. Now talk about an impressive book for not being very big at all. So let's go over the synopsis together. Leah is changed. A marine biologist, she left for a routine expedition months earlier, only this time her submarine sank to the sea floor. When she finally surfaces and returns home, her wife, Miri, knows that something is wrong. Barely eating and lost in her thoughts, Leah rotates between rooms in their apartment, running the taps morning and night. Whatever happened in that vessel, whatever it was they were supposed to be studying before they were stranded, Leah has carried part of it with her, onto dry land and into their home. As Miri searches for answers, desperate to understand what happened below the water, she must face the possibility that the woman she loves is slipping from her grasp. So, as you can hear from the synopsis, the story itself I found to be very unique. We're following this married couple where one is a marine biologist. She does this all the time. She goes out on these dives. They're gone for, a few weeks at a time, and then they come home and spend time with their families. But this time, she doesn't return until suddenly she does. And everything about her is changed. So whether or not you have had a partner in your life, whether in the past or currently, you know what it is like to maybe be with someone who starts to change over time and how that can affect the dynamic in a relationship. And that at the end of the day is what this story was about. It's about two people who are in love and committed to each other, but major changes have happened to them in their relationship and kind of like their psyches and their personalities. It ended up feeling like this almost gothic novel because of the atmosphere, like being surrounded by the ocean, by the sea, by someone being kind of like stranded underwater, coming up and needing water at all times, and feeling like someone has changed, not just emotionally and mentally, but physically as well. I would say that this book went in a direction that I didn't really see coming, but I did feel very invested in the story and finding out what was going to happen to these characters. Books like that are always so easy for me to read, especially when they're under like that 300-page mark. If I'm invested, if I feel like I'm connected to the characters, I want to know what happens to them. I am going to have a hard time putting the book down, and that is what this book was like for me. One of the best books I think I read in 2024. So next up, we have Hurricane Girl by Marcy Dermansky, and this also comes in at a whopping 240 pages. Now, what a wild ride, like quite literally wild, that this story ended up being. So it is aptly titled Hurricane Girl, and for a very good reason, because we follow our main character named Allison, who has just recently bought her own home for the first time ever. She is standing on her own 2 feet after finally leaving a toxic relationship. Like, she bolts out of there. She takes all of the money in her savings account, buys this house, and she's like, this is it. This is mine. And I am finally living the life I am supposed to live. Then comes a hurricane, and then ensues the entirely kind of messed up story that unfolds for our main character. Her house basically gets blown to bits, and she doesn't know what to do now because she doesn't have any money left to her name. So now Allison is kind of in peril. She's floating around. She doesn't really know what to do. Everything is kind of just like moving on around her. She's interviewed by the local news at one point in time, and she just feels like she's kind of living in this weird fever dream. So she ends up going to a local bar where she just tries to drink her worries away, and she runs into the cameraman that was part of the local news crew. He seems really nice. He feels bad for what happened. He saw what had happened to her house, and he offers her a place to stay. So she takes this cameraman up on his offer. She goes back to his house, and then boom, of course, something terrible happens, and she regrets ever deciding to go back to his home with him. The whole book gives off that very fever dream feeling where now she's just kind of like, oh shit, I'm in trouble and I gotta get out of this situation and I just gotta go. I gotta go somewhere. I gotta go back home. I gotta go to my mom. So she literally just runs away again. Like, she flees the scene and doesn't even really fully comprehend everything that has happened to her, like within the last couple of days. She's just kind of going through the motions. So it ends up being this very interesting story. I will say check trigger warnings on this book because there are a few things in here that are not necessarily the easiest to read. But it was a very unique blend of humor and these really heavy things happening to our main character. It's kind of like just when tragedy strikes and you're trying to find anything that can get you through, even if it's like a good laugh. I think at the end of the day, I just really, really loved Marcy Dermansky's writing. This darkness mixed in with like this humor and also just this woman who becomes a little bit unhinged and trying to just figure everything out. Like she thought she was on a path to something and then boom, everything was literally blown off of the map and now she's got to like go back to the drawing board. But first she's got to get her together to do that. It was really kind of, again, funny. And also a little bit grotesque at times. And I was immensely hooked on it. It really kind of pushed me into a trend over the summer where I couldn't get enough of not just women's rights, but women's wrongs. So if you are into stories about women just doing what they need to survive, do not pass up on this book. It was truly a wild ride and I highly recommend it. All right, hang in there with me, friends, because we have made it to our last and final book on the list, and it is the biggest book on our list, coming in at 288 pages, and that is Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. I have talked about this book a few times and how it was my introduction to Olivia Blake and why I even bothered picking up any of her other books. This, to me, is where she truly shines, which is her short novels. And this one specifically because it is a very gripping prose where it also has kind of that stream of consciousness narrative, but in a way that doesn't feel so chaotic that you can't comprehend what is going on. So let's read this one together as well. Chicago, sometime. Two people meet in the Art Institute by chance. Prior to their encounter, he is a doctoral student who manages his destructive thoughts with compulsive calculations about time travel. She is a bipolar counterfeit artist undergoing court-ordered psychotherapy. By the end of the story, these things will still be true. But this is not a story about endings. For Reagan, people are predictable and tedious, including and perhaps especially herself. She copes with dreariness of existence by living impulsively, imagining a new, alternate timeline being created in the wake of every rash decision. To Aldo, the world feels disturbingly chaotic. He gets through his days by erecting a wall of routine, a backbeat of rules and formulas that keep him going. Without them, the entire framework of his existence would collapse. For Reagan and Aldo, life has been a matter of resigning themselves to the blueprints of inevitability until the two meet. Could 6 conversations with a stranger be the variable that shakes up the entire simulation? So you can hear from the synopsis itself, these are both very troubled people in their own ways. So Aldo is very much a type A person. He constructs his life into a routine. He's wickedly smart. He's a teacher, and he likes to keep everything in like their own neat little boxes and compartments. Reagan is the total opposite. She's impulsive. She has actually been in trouble with the law for being a counterfeit artist. And she is just a very hectic person. And they end up meeting at this art institute and boom, this romance just soars. And it's not a good romance, as you can probably tell. They have that love that is like an undying love for each other. They are obsessed. That feeling you get when all you can think about is that other person, that is both of them with each other. And of course, they start to develop this very toxic dynamic between the two of them, where they're both kind of becoming enablers for the other person, with their like personality flaws, I guess, if you want to call them that. So it definitely feels like a chaotic ride as you are reading it, but it also feels like a very intimate story as well. You kind of just get very invested in both of them. And they both at different times of the book both drive you crazy and also like you love them and you want to see something good happen for them. Again, I really think that Olivia Blake shines in these shorter novels. She has such a beautiful prose with that stream of consciousness writing style, but again, something that you can really follow from start to finish, and a very, very beautiful story. And without giving like too much away about the book, I'll just say that it doesn't necessarily end maybe the way you think it would, or at least it didn't end the way I thought it would. And the story just really left me feeling like full of love, like just absolutely bursting at the seams with love. Oh, all right, my friends. Well, there you have it. Those are all of the books that I think that you could sit down and read in one weekend's time. And what a list of books we ended up with. Like, I think this is the longest list we have gone over in quite a while. So per usual, I would love to know if you have read any of the books that we talked about in today's video. What are your thoughts and opinions on those books? Or if you have a book that falls in either one of the categories that we went through today, drop that in a comment below as well, because I love a shorty, let me tell you, and I'm always looking for more to add to my personal TBR. I would also like to thank the partner of today's video, Novelwicks Candles, one more time, and don't forget that you can use that code Lori10 to get a discount on anything in the shop. Check out that website down below. As always, if you liked this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button because it always helps a girl out. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any of my other upcoming videos, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. As always, it has been an absolute blast, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next one.